23 people vanished across Silicon Valley in 8 months, and the world kept spinning like nothing had happened. Not the FDA who filed my reports in bureaucratic black holes. Not the tech media, too obsessed with IPO announcements and billion-dollar acquisitions. Just me, Caroline O'Brien, sitting in my cramped Mountain View apartment at 3:17 in the morning, surrounded by patent applications and missing persons reports that nobody else bothered to connect. The faces stared back at me from printouts taped to every available wall surface. Jordan Wu, 31, software engineer, disappeared after responding to a clinical trial recruitment email. Natasha Volkov, 28, biotech researcher, last seen entering a Sunnyvale office building for what she thought was a job interview. Christopher Hayes, 26, phlebotomist at Stanford Medical, vanished during his lunch break in February. 23 faces. 23 lives reduced to case numbers that law enforcement treated like administrative inconveniences. The police called them transients. Adults with the legal right to disappear, probably chasing opportunities in other cities, maybe running from debt or bad relationships. No foul play suspected. No investigation warranted. Case closed before it ever opened. Except Jordan's brother showed me the text messages. Excited plans about a medical trial that would pay $5,000 for a weekend of blood work. Enough to cover 3 months of rent. Natasha's roommate described the meticulous way she'd organized her research notes, labeled everything in her apartment, left instructions for plant watering. These weren't the actions of someone planning to vanish. Christopher's sister worked in hospital administration and had accessed his employee records. He'd requested time off 3 weeks in advance for the trial dates, submitted his vacation paperwork, arranged coverage for his shifts. These weren't people running toward new lives. They were people who walked into something they thought was legitimate and never walked back out. I'd been investigating this pattern for 3 months, sleeping maybe 4 hours a night when exhaustion finally won, living on coffee that tasted like desperation and the protein bars I kept forgetting to eat. My apartment looked like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream, red string connecting photographs, patent documents spread across every flat surface, a map of Silicon Valley covered in pins marking last known locations. My supervisor at the Patent Investigation Office, Rebecca Walsh, had stopped taking my calls. Our last conversation played on loop in my head. "Caroline, you're obsessing over your sister's case again. This isn't healthy. These patent applications are routine. 3 companies filing similar technologies isn't unusual. It's called market competition. You need to let this go before it destroys what's left of your career." But Rebecca hadn't seen what I'd seen. 3 biotech startups. NextGen Blood Solutions, Crimson Therapeutics, Eternal Preservation Incorporated, had filed virtually identical patents for revolutionary blood preservation technology within a 6-month window. The language was too similar to be coincidence. The timing too precise. And when I cross-referenced the patent filing dates with missing persons data, the pattern emerged like a constellation only I could see. Every disappearance clustered within 2 weeks of a patent filing. Every victim had rare blood types, AB negative, O negative, the universal donors, and 3 cases of Rh-null, the rarest blood type on Earth. Every single one had responded to recruitment materials for clinical trials that promised generous compensation for minimal time commitment. I'd traced their digital footprints through social media, email accounts their families gave me access to, credit card statements that painted timelines in Starbucks purchases and bridge toll timestamps. The trail always ended at the same 3 locations. A sleek office building in Sunnyvale, a converted warehouse in Redwood City, a medical facility near San Jose Airport that Google Earth showed as active but business registries listed as vacant. Before we dive in, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit that subscribe button if you're new here. Smash the like button if you're already hooked and drop a comment letting me know what country you're watching from. I love getting to know each of you. Also stay tuned because tomorrow's story is going to be just as epic, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Now let's get back to the story. 6 years ago, my sister Bridget disappeared the same way. She'd been 23, fresh out of graduate school with a master's in biochemistry and student debt that kept her awake at night. When she told me about the Stanford Medical Center clinical trial, $3,000 for a weekend of blood work and medical monitoring, I'd been proud of her. Proud that she was contributing to scientific research while solving her financial problems. Practical. Smart. Her last text message still lived on my phone, preserved like a digital grave marker. First treatment session today. They're so professional here. The facility is amazing. Love you, Carl. I'll call you Sunday night with details. Sunday night never came. The police filed a missing persons report that went nowhere. Stanford Medical Center had no record of any clinical trial matching her description. The phone number on the recruitment flyer was disconnected. The address led to an empty office suite. Bridget O'Brien vanished into administrative void. One more statistic in a city where people disappeared into the machinery of ambition and desperation. For 6 years I'd been searching. For 6 years I'd been building a case that nobody wanted to prosecute. I'd moved from investigative journalism to patent investigation, thinking that corporate paper trails might reveal what human interest stories couldn't. I'd become the person people avoided at parties, the obsessive sister who couldn't accept that some disappearances don't have explanations. But this time was different. This time I had documentation. 3 months ago, I'd submitted a formal inquiry to the patent office about the suspicious similarity in the blood preservation patents. 2 months ago, my inquiry was rejected for insufficient evidence of fraud. 6 weeks ago, I'd noticed my apartment showed signs of professional searching. Nothing obvious, just small details wrong. Coffee mug moved. Papers reorganized. Laptop showing access attempts in the security logs. Someone knew I was investigating. Someone with resources and motivation to monitor a mid-level patent investigator who should have been invisible in the bureaucratic machinery. 4 days ago I'd done something reckless. I'd used my credentials to access next-gen blood solutions in Sunnyvale after hours, claiming routine verification procedures. The security guard barely looked at my ID before waving me through. Inside, I'd photographed everything my phone could capture. Industrial blood storage units, medical equipment designed for extended sedation, holding cells disguised as patient recovery rooms with reinforced doors and monitoring systems. And then I'd seen the patient roster. 23 names. 23 blood types. 23 people who'd entered this facility through recruitment promises and were now listed as active subjects in ongoing preservation protocols. My hands had shaken so badly I'd almost dropped my phone. This wasn't corporate fraud. This was systematic human trafficking dressed in medical legitimacy. I'd uploaded everything to encrypted cloud storage and fled, certain that security cameras had captured my face with perfect clarity. The black SUV appeared outside my apartment building the next morning. Tinted windows. No license plates visible. It followed me to work, maintaining careful distance but making no attempt to hide its presence. Followed me to the grocery store. Followed me to the coffee shop where I tried to work without drowning in paranoia. Yesterday my phone buzzed with an unknown number. The message was brief. Stop investigating or become a subject yourself. You have 48 hours. Attached was a photograph of me taken through my apartment window, standing in my kitchen 2 nights ago, visible and vulnerable and completely unaware I was being watched. I should have gone to the police. Should have contacted the FBI, the state attorney general, someone with authority and resources beyond my failing career and obsessive determination. But I'd learned what institutional indifference looked like. I'd watched bureaucracy swallow my sister without a trace. Instead, I'd called Dr. Imogen Reeves, a hematologist at Stanford whose name appeared on consultation records for 2 of the 3 companies. She'd refused to meet privately. Too dangerous, she'd said. Her voice had carried the tremor of genuine fear. But she'd agreed to meet publicly at Maison Nouveau, an exclusive Palo Alto restaurant where nothing can happen in front of witnesses. Now it was Thursday evening and I was walking into that restaurant wearing my only nice dress. Navy blue, conservative, completely inappropriate for the tech executive casual that dominated every table. My leather messenger bag felt heavy with documentation I'd compiled over 3 months. Evidence of 23 kidnappings. Proof of my sister's fate, 6 years delayed. The hostess smiled with practiced professionalism and led me through exposed brick and Edison bulbs to table 8 in the back section. I'd requested a position with clear views of the entrance, old journalist habits dying hard despite my career change. I ordered coffee I didn't want and tried to steady my hands. That's when I noticed table 17. 4 men in impeccable suits, the kind of tailoring that costs more than my monthly rent. But it was the man at the head of the table who made my breath catch. Not from attraction, though he was striking in an unsettling way, but from wrongness my rational mind couldn't process. Alaric Saltzman. I recognized him from Forbes profiles about reclusive tech investors who'd somehow maintained billion-dollar portfolios across decades without aging in photographs. His skin was too pale, too perfect, like porcelain that had never seen sun damage. His dark hair was swept back with precision that seemed deliberately styled yet naturally effortless. And his eyes, even from across the restaurant, I could see they weren't quite right. Brown from a distance, but catching the candlelight with red undertones that shouldn't exist in human irises. He lifted his wine glass with movements that were too controlled, too precise, like every gesture was calculated for maximum efficiency. His three companions deferred to him with body language that went beyond professional respect into something closer to fear dressed as reverence. I forced myself to look away, to focus on the entrance where Dr. Reeves should be appearing. My coffee arrived. I didn't touch it. My phone sat on the table, fully charged, emergency contacts ready, though I had no illusion that 911 would help if things went wrong. At 7:47, three figures entered the restaurant. They didn't check in with the hostess. Didn't wait to be seated. Just walked directly toward my table with purpose that made the temperature drop and my survival instincts scream warnings my conscious mind was still processing. I recognized one of them from security footage at NextGen. Tall, angular features, movements that suggested predatory grace rather than human locomotion. The other diner seemed oblivious or deliberately ignoring what was happening, conversations continuing around us like reality itself was fragmenting. Dr. Reeves never appeared. I was alone, trapped in the back section of an expensive restaurant with three people who weren't people at all, and no way out that didn't involve walking directly past them. That's when I grabbed my lipstick, Chanel Rouge Noir, the one expensive item I owned, a birthday gift from Bridget 6 years ago, and wrote in desperate capital letters across the white linen tablecloth, "Help." And Alaric Saltzman, seated at table 17 with his red-tinted eyes and impossible stillness, looked directly at me. Not at my table. At me. Like he'd been watching the entire time, waiting to see what I would do when the monsters finally came to collect their wayward investigator. His expression shifted into something I couldn't read. Recognition, calculation, or perhaps the faintest trace of respect for prey that refused to die quietly. He stood with fluid grace that defied physics, crossed the distance between us in strides that covered too much ground too quickly, and everything I thought I understood about the world shattered like glass against the truth I'd been investigating without realizing it. I wasn't looking for human traffickers. I was looking for something that had been feeding on humanity for centuries, hiding behind corporate legitimacy and medical research and the kind of power that made witnesses disappear. I was looking for vampires. And I just asked their king for help. The pattern emerged at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, the way truth often does in the hours when rational people are sleeping and only the obsessed remain conscious. I'd been staring at patent applications for 6 hours straight, my eyes burning from screen glare and the particular exhaustion that comes from hunting ghosts in legal documents. My apartment looked like the workspace of someone who'd stopped pretending to be functional. Papers covered every surface. The kitchen table buried under missing persons reports. The living room floor transformed into a timeline of disappearances marked with different colored sticky notes. The wall above my desk papered with printouts of patent filings that I'd read so many times I could recite them from memory. Red pins in my Silicon Valley map marked last known locations. Blue pins marked the biotech facilities. Yellow pins marked where the digital trails went cold. I'd stopped apologizing for the mess weeks ago. Stopped inviting anyone over. Stopped pretending I was anything other than what Bridget's disappearance had made me. Someone who couldn't let go, who saw patterns in chaos, who trusted documentation more than human reassurance. The coffee in my mug had gone cold hours ago, but I drank it anyway. Caffeine was caffeine. My auburn hair had escaped its ponytail at some point during the night, strands falling across my face as I hunched over my laptop, cross-referencing the third biotech company's patent filing against my database of missing persons. That's when I saw it. The language in Eternal Preservation Incorporated's application matched. Not similar, matched. Sections of the NextGen and Crimson patents. Same technical terminology. Same grammatical constructions. Same innovative claims about extending blood viability through proprietary cellular preservation matrices. I pulled up the filing dates. NextGen, September 15th. Crimson, November 3rd. Eternal, December 22nd. 6 weeks apart, perfectly spaced. Then I overlaid my missing persons timeline. Jordan Wu disappeared September 28, 13 days after the first patent filing. Natasha Volkov vanished November 17, 14 days after the second. Christopher Hayes went missing January 4, also 13 days after the third filing. The pattern held across all 23 disappearances. Every victim vanished within 2 weeks of a patent filing date. Every single one had responded to clinical trial recruitment that promised compensation for blood donation. Everyone had rare blood types that made them valuable to blood banks. And apparently, to whoever was operating these facilities. I grabbed my worn leather messenger bag and started shoving documentation inside with shaking hands. This wasn't circumstantial anymore. This was systematic. This was evidence of coordinated operation across multiple shell companies, all filing patents to establish legal cover for whatever they were actually doing with human subjects. This was how I could find Bridget. The meeting with Rebecca Walsh happened 3 days later, after I'd spent 72 hours compiling evidence into a formal report that I genuinely believed would change everything. I'd printed everything: patent comparisons, missing persons correlations, photographs of the facilities, timeline analyses that showed pattern probability far beyond coincidence. Rebecca's office at the Patent Investigation Office felt sterile compared to my apartment's organized chaos. Everything had a place here. Files properly labeled. Desk clear except for a single coffee mug and a framed photograph of Rebecca's kids. The kind of order that came from accepting limitations rather than fighting them. She didn't look at my report. Just looked at me with the expression I'd come to recognize as professional concern masking personal frustration. "Caroline, we need to talk about your performance," she began, and I knew immediately that I'd miscalculated. This wasn't going to be a conversation about investigative breakthroughs. This was an intervention. "Rebecca, if you just look at the patent language." "I've looked at it. I had Thompson in legal review your analysis." She pushed the report back across her desk toward me. 3 companies filing similar patents isn't unusual. It's called market competition. Multiple firms often pursue the same innovations simultaneously. But the disappearances are tragic and completely unrelated to patent filings. Her voice softened slightly. "Caroline, I know you're still trying to find answers about Bridget. I understand that impulse. But you're seeing connections that aren't there. You're wasting departmental resources on personal matters, and I can't protect you from that anymore." The words landed like physical blows. Wasting resources. Personal matters. The institutional language of dismissal, of cases that weren't worth pursuing, of victims who didn't matter enough for anyone to care. "I'm putting you on notice," Rebecca continued. "Focus on your assigned cases. Stop pursuing this. If you can't do that, I'll have to recommend reassignment or termination." I gathered my report with careful precision, maintaining composure through years of practice at hiding pain behind professional competence. "Understood. Caroline." He stopped me at the door. "I'm not trying to be cruel. I'm trying to help you keep your career. Sometimes we have to accept that we can't save everyone. Even the people we love most." I didn't tell her that acceptance felt like betrayal. That stopping the investigation meant abandoning Bridget to whatever fate had claimed her 6 years ago. I just nodded and left, carrying my rejected evidence back to the apartment where truth apparently only mattered to me. That night I found the first sign that I wasn't paranoid. I was right. My apartment door was locked the same way I'd left it that morning, but inside something was wrong. Nothing obvious. Nothing that would convince anyone who didn't live in their own meticulously organized chaos. But my coffee mug was on the wrong side of the sink. The papers on my kitchen table had been moved. Someone had looked through them and replaced them in almost the right order. Almost. My laptop sat exactly where I'd left it, but the security log showed 3 failed login attempts at 2:47 p.m., while I'd been at the office being told I was wasting resources on conspiracy theories. Someone had been here. Someone with professional skills and clear interest in what I knew. Someone who wanted me to know they'd been here, because they'd left just enough evidence for me to find. I spent the next 2 hours documenting everything with photographs, then uploaded copies to encrypted cloud storage. If they came back, if something happened to me, at least the evidence would survive. The decision to break into NextGen came from desperation rather than courage. I had 48 hours before they'd decide what to do with me. The anonymous text had been clear about that timeline. 48 hours to gather proof that even institutional indifference couldn't ignore, or 48 hours to become the 24th person on my missing persons map. I drove to Sunnyvale at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday, wearing my most professional blazer and carrying my official credentials. The security guard barely glanced at my ID before waving me through, probably assuming anyone working this late was important enough not to question. Inside, NextGen looked exactly like what it claimed to be. A cutting-edge biotech facility pursuing revolutionary medical research. Clean hallways. Expensive equipment visible through laboratory windows. Everything designed to project legitimacy and scientific progress. Except the third floor, which required keycard access, I bypassed using an old journalist trick involving social engineering and a maintenance worker who believed I'd been sent by administration to verify environmental controls. The third floor had no windows. No laboratories. Just corridors lined with doors that had medical monitoring equipment mounted beside them and locks that belonged on prison cells rather than patient rooms. I photographed everything my phone could capture. Industrial blood storage units designed for volumes that made no sense for research. Medical equipment configured for long-term sedation rather than short-term trials. And through the narrow window of one locked door, I saw a young man unconscious on a hospital bed, for lines running from both arms, monitoring equipment tracking vital signs that suggested he'd been here far longer than any legitimate trial would require. The patient roster on the nurse's station computer showed 23 active subjects. 23 names I recognized from my missing persons database. 23 people who'd walked into facilities like this thinking they were participating in paid medical research and had never walked back out. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped my phone. This was it. This was proof. This was everything I'd needed to force investigation to find Bridget, to stop whatever systematic operation had been feeding on vulnerable people for years. The security camera mounted in the corner had a clear view of my face. I'd been too focused on documentation to think about concealment. They knew exactly who'd been here, what I'd seen, what I now knew. I fled before anyone could respond, driving home with paranoia, making every pair of headlights behind me feel like pursuit. The black SUV appeared the next morning. Tinted windows. No license plates. It sat across from my apartment building with obvious intent, like they wanted me to know I was being watched. When I drove to work, it followed 3 cars back. When I went to the coffee shop, it parked where I could see it through the windows. They were deciding what to do with me. Whether I was worth silencing or just frightening into submission. Whether I'd learned my lesson or needed to be taught one more permanently. The text message arrived at 9:43 p.m. Stop investigating or become a subject yourself. You have 48 hours. The attached photograph showed me standing in my own kitchen 2 nights ago, visible through the window I'd forgotten to close, completely unaware I was being watched. I stared at that image for a long time, at my own face caught in artificial light, at the evidence of my vulnerability. Then I picked up my phone and called Dr. Imogen Reeves, whose name appeared on consultation records for 2 of the 3 companies. If I had 48 hours, I was going to use every minute to get answers, even if it meant walking directly into whatever trap they'd prepared for people who asked too many questions. Dr. Imogen Reeves sounded terrified on the phone, her voice dropping to a whisper despite presumably being alone in her Stanford office. I can't meet privately. It's not safe. But Maison Nouveau, the restaurant in Palo Alto, nothing can happen there. Too public. Too many witnesses. The logic felt thin even as I agreed to it, but desperation made people believe in the protection of crowds and expensive table settings. We set the meeting for Thursday evening, 7:30, which gave me 24 hours to prepare documentation and 36 hours remaining on my anonymous deadline. I spent Thursday afternoon trying to eat something that my anxious stomach would accept, then standing in front of my closet realizing I owned nothing appropriate for Palo Alto's casual tech wealth. I settled on my only nice dress, navy blue conservative cut, the one I'd bought for Bridget's graduate school ceremony 6 years ago and hadn't worn since. It felt like wearing a costume, especially paired with my worn leather messenger bag that I couldn't bring myself to leave behind. The bag held copies of everything. Something happened to me, at least the evidence would survive. Maison Nouveau occupied a converted warehouse with the kind of studied elegance that Silicon Valley did so well. Exposed brick and timber beams softened by Edison bulbs that cast warm light over white linen tablecloths. The clientele wore the tech executive casual that cost more than my monthly rent, designer jeans, cashmere sweaters, watches that probably required insurance policies. I felt immediately out of place, which the hostess's professional smile did nothing to alleviate. Table for one? Meeting someone. Reservation under Reeves. She led me through the main dining area to a quieter back section with perhaps a dozen tables. I requested table 8 specifically, positioned where I could see the entrance clearly. Old journalist habits refusing to die despite my career change. The hostess brought water and a menu I barely glanced at, too focused on watching for Dr. Reeves's arrival. That's when I noticed table 17, positioned near the stone fireplace where flames cast dancing shadows across 4 men in impeccable suits. 3 of them were clearly subordinates, expensive clothing, confident posture, but with body language that screamed deference. The 4th man sat at the head of their table like a monarch holding court, and something about him made my skin prickle with instinctive unease. I recognized his face from Forbes profiles and TechCrunch articles. Alaric Saltzman, the reclusive billionaire who'd somehow maintained influence in Silicon Valley for decades despite never seeming to age in photographs that spanned 30 years. The articles called him a genius investor, prescient about technological trends, generous with philanthropic donations but intensely private about personal life. Up close, or as close as across a restaurant allowed, he was striking in a way that didn't feel entirely human. His skin was too pale, too flawless, like porcelain that had never seen sun damage or the normal imperfections of living skin. Dark hair swept back from sharp features that were almost too symmetrical. And his eyes, even from this distance, caught the firelight wrong. They appeared brown in shadow but flashed red when the flames hit them at certain angles, like light reflecting off a predator's retinas in the dark. He lifted his wine glass with precision that seemed calculated, every movement economical and controlled in a way that suggested either military training or something else entirely. His 3 companions watched him constantly, seeking approval, flinching slightly when he spoke. Fear dressed as respect, the kind of dynamic I'd seen in investigative pieces about corporate tyrants and cult leaders. I forced myself to look away, to focus on the entrance where Dr. Reeves should be appearing any moment. My coffee arrived. I wrapped both hands around the cup for warmth despite the restaurant's comfortable temperature. 7:30 came and went. 7:45. At 7:52 Dr. Reeves finally appeared, and I knew immediately that this meeting was a mistake. She looked haggard, years older than her faculty photograph suggested, with a particular exhaustion that comes from sustained fear rather than simple overwork. Her eyes darted around the restaurant as the hostess led her to my table, and when she sat down across from me, her hands were shaking. "You need to stop investigating," she began without preamble, voice barely above a whisper. "Caroline, I can call you Caroline. Whatever you think you've found, you're wrong. Or you're right in ways that are so much worse than you understand. Dr. Reeves, I have documentation. I know what you have. I know what you photographed at NextGen." Her voice cracked slightly. "That's why you need to stop. These companies, they're not what you think. There are forces involved that don't follow normal rules. Scientific rules. Legal rules. Human rules." The last word landed with particular emphasis, and something cold settled in my stomach. "What do you mean, human rules? Your sister didn't just disappear. She was..." Dr. Reeves stopped mid-sentence, her eyes fixing on something behind me. All color drained from her face. "Oh God. They're here. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She stood abruptly, knocking over her water glass, and fled toward the bathroom corridor before I could stop her. I turned to see what had frightened a Stanford hematologist so thoroughly she'd abandoned a meeting she'd agreed to. 3 figures had entered the restaurant. They didn't check in with the hostess or wait to be seated. They simply walked directly toward my table with purpose that made other diners unconsciously shift away, conversations faltering around them like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. I recognized the one in front from security footage at NextGen, tall, angular features, with the kind of sharp elegance that suggested European aristocracy. He moved like a predator, each step precise and controlled, scanning the restaurant with eyes that assessed rather than observed. The 2 flanking him positioned themselves with tactical efficiency, one blocking the front entrance, one cutting off the bathroom corridor where Dr. Reeves had fled. The temperature in the restaurant seemed to drop as they approached, though that was impossible. Just my fear manifesting as physical sensation. Just adrenaline making me hypersensitive to everything. The leader reached my table and sat down across from me without invitation, settling into Dr. Reeves's abandoned chair with fluid grace that reminded me disturbingly of how Alaric Saltzman had moved when lifting his wine glass. "Ms. O'Brien," he said, and his voice carried a French accent that made my name sound like a diagnosis. "You've been very persistent. That ends tonight." My phone sat on the table beside my coffee cup. I reached for it with shaking hands, thinking of 911, of Rebecca Walsh, of anyone who might help. He was faster. His hand shot across the table and grabbed my phone before I could touch it, then simply closed his fist around it. Metal and glass compressed with a grinding crunch that shouldn't have been possible without tools or machinery. When he opened his hand, my phone was a crushed mass of components and broken screen. "No calls," he said pleasantly. "No recordings. Just a quiet conversation about you forgetting everything you've seen." I realized three things simultaneously with the clarity that comes from pure terror. 1. This man had just crushed a phone with his bare hand. 2. He wasn't human, couldn't be human because humans didn't have that kind of strength. 3. I was going to die here in an expensive restaurant while other diners ate their meals and discussed stock options and didn't notice a woman being murdered at table 8. My purse sat in my lap. My hands fumbled through it with desperation's blind efficiency, past wallet and keys and documentation, finding the one item that felt like Bridget's presence. The lipstick she'd given me for my birthday 6 years ago. Chanel Rouge Noir, the one expensive cosmetic I owned. I grabbed it with shaking hands, uncapped it, and wrote across the white linen tablecloth in desperate capital letters, "Help." The man across from me, Lucien, I would learn later, Lucien Moreau, watched with amusement that didn't reach his cold eyes. "How quaint. You think someone here will save you?" Before I could answer, before he could do whatever he'd planned, a voice cut through the restaurant with casual authority that made everyone freeze. "Interesting meeting, Lucien. You failed to request permission to operate in my territory." Alaric Saltzman stood beside our table. I hadn't heard him approach, hadn't seen him move from table 17, but suddenly he was there with presence that filled the space around him. Up close, I could see what I'd missed from across the restaurant. His eyes weren't brown, they were deep crimson like garnets or blood viewed through crystal. His canines were slightly too long, visible when he spoke, suggesting either cosmetic modification or something else entirely. And his skin had no pores, no imperfections, no signs of the normal texture that came from being alive and human and mortal. He looked down at the tablecloth, at my desperate plea written in lipstick, and something shifted in his expression. Not pity exactly, but recognition perhaps. "This human is under my protection," he said, and his voice held weight that went beyond volume. "Leave. Now." Lucien stood slowly, deliberately, and for a moment violence hung in the air like electricity before a lightning strike. The two men were utterly still, facing each other across my table, and I understood with instinctive certainty that I was watching apex predators negotiate territory while I sat frozen between them. Then Lucien bowed slightly, mockery wrapped in submission, the gesture of someone yielding to superior force while promising future defiance. "Of course, my lord. We weren't aware she was claimed." The word "claimed" carried implications that made my skin crawl. "Though perhaps you should inform your pet that investigating our affairs comes with consequences. Perhaps you should remember whose territory you're operating in without authorization." Alaric's voice remained calm, but something in it made Lucien's companions take an involuntary step backward. Lucien smiled without warmth. "This isn't over, Alaric. The old ways are changing. Your sympathy for cattle will be your downfall." He turned and walked toward the entrance, his two associates falling into formation. At the door, he paused and looked back at me with eyes that promised we'd meet again. Then they disappeared into the Palo Alto evening, leaving me shaking and alive and completely unable to process what I'd just witnessed. Alaric sat down across from me with fluid grace, signaled to a waiter who appeared instantly despite the restaurant's earlier inattention. "2 glasses of the Chateau Margaux," he said, then looked at me with those impossible red eyes. "You need wine more than coffee right now." I couldn't argue. Couldn't speak. My hands were trembling so badly I had to grip the edge of the table to steady them. Alaric watched me with expression I couldn't read. Assessment mixed with something that might have been concern or might have been calculation. "We need to talk, Ms. O'Brien. But not here." His voice was calm, measured, with hints of accent underneath modern English. old-world phrasing, aristocratic cadence that suggested he'd learned the language before it became American. Those were vampires. The ones you've been investigating without realizing it. And congratulations, you've just survived an encounter that kills most humans. Vampires. The word should have sounded insane. Should have triggered my scientific skepticism, my rational worldview, my training in evidence-based analysis. But I just watched a man crush a phone with his bare hand. Had seen Dr. Reeves flee in terror from creatures who moved wrong and looked wrong and radiated predatory threat that bypassed conscious thought. "Hi sister," I whispered. "Is she dead?" "No. Something much more complicated." Alaric's limousine appeared outside with timing that suggested he'd summoned it somehow. "Come with me. I'll show you what became of Bridget. I'll explain why I've spent 6 years trying to shut down Lucien's operation without starting a war that would kill thousands." "You wanted truth, Ms. O'Brien." He stood and offered his hand. I stared at it, pale, perfect, belonging to something that called itself a vampire and had just saved my life for reasons I didn't understand. "Where are we going?" My voice sounded distant, disconnected, like someone else was asking questions while I floated above my body processing impossible realities. "The Santa Cruz Mountains. My estate. Somewhere we can talk freely without." He glanced around the restaurant where diners had returned to their meals, conversations resuming as if nothing had happened. As if 3 predators hadn't just negotiated my survival over white linen and expensive wine. Without witnesses who shouldn't know what they've seen. I thought of my apartment with its walls covered in evidence. Of Rebecca Walsh's dismissal. Of 48 hours that had become irrelevant because the people hunting me weren't human and didn't follow human rules. I thought of Bridget's last text message, 6 years old and still burning in my memory. I took his hand. His skin was cold. Not corpse cold, but the coolness of marble, of something that didn't generate its own heat. He helped me to my feet with strength that could have crushed me as easily as Lucien had crushed my phone, then guided me toward the entrance with proprietary confidence. The limousine's door closed behind us with a solid thunk that felt impossibly final. As we pulled away from Maison Nouveau, leaving behind the warm light and the oblivious diners and the last remnants of my rational worldview, Alaric turned to me with expression that was almost gentle. "Prepare to never sleep soundly again, Caroline. Because once you know the truth about what exists in the darkness, you can never unknow it. And your sister has been living in that darkness for 6 years, waiting for someone to find her." The limousine drove into the night, carrying me toward answers I'd spent 6 years seeking and truths I'd never imagined could exist outside of fiction. Behind us, Silicon Valley glittered with 10,000 lights, and I understood for the first time that beneath all that innovation and progress, older things were feeding in the shadows. Alaric's estate materialized from the darkness like something from architectural fantasy. A modernist compound of glass and steel built into the Santa Cruz mountain hillside, all clean lines and impossible angles that shouldn't have been structurally sound but somehow were. Lights glowed from within, warm against the cold redwood forest surrounding it, making the building look almost welcoming despite its isolation. A woman met us at the entrance, middle-aged with kind eyes and the practiced efficiency of someone who'd worked in service for decades. "Mr. Saltzman, your guest suite is prepared." "Thank you, Veronica." Alaric guided me through hallways that were somehow both minimalist and luxurious, polished concrete floors, exposed steel beams, artwork that even my untrained eye recognized as museum quality. He stopped at a door near the end of the east wing. "You'll be comfortable here. The locks work from the inside." He paused meaningfully. "I want you to feel safe even if that word has lost all meaning tonight." The suite was larger than my entire apartment, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the forest and a bathroom that looked like something from luxury hotel magazines. I checked the locks immediately. Solid, well-maintained, definitely functional from the interior. As if that would matter against creatures that could crush phones with their bare hands. I didn't sleep. How could I? I sat on the bed fully clothed, watching the door, waiting for dawn and some semblance of clarity that the darkness refused to provide. Around 4 a.m., exhaustion finally won over adrenaline, dragging me into unconsciousness that felt more like collapse than rest. Morning arrived with sunlight streaming through those massive windows, and I woke disoriented, heart racing before remembering where I was and why. A manila folder sat on the nightstand beside me. I would have sworn it wasn't there when I'd finally passed out. Inside were research files that made my own investigation look amateur by comparison. Documentation of the Sanguine Collective's operation compiled over 6 years. Patent applications I recognized alongside supernatural elements I had no framework for understanding. Vampire blood bonding, thrall compulsion, trafficking networks that stretched back centuries rather than months. Photographs of facilities I'd found and dozens I hadn't. And a note in elegant handwriting that looked like calligraphy. You deserve context before making decisions. Join me for breakfast when ready. I found him on a terrace overlooking redwood forests that stretched toward the Pacific. Morning sun filtered through specialized glass that cast everything in slightly amber tones. He sat at a table with coffee and what looked like a continental breakfast spread, reading a newspaper like this was normal, like last night hadn't shattered every assumption I'd built my worldview on. The glass filters UV radiation, he said without looking up. We can tolerate indirect sunlight, but it's uncomfortable. Like standing too close to a fire. Survivable but not pleasant. I sat down across from him with the folder clutched in my hands. What are you exactly? I want the biological explanation, not the mythology. How does vampirism work mechanically? What's the scientific basis for? I gestured vaguely at him at the impossibility of his existence. He smiled, genuinely amused. You're attempting to catalog me like a patent application. I appreciate the consistency. He poured me coffee with hands that didn't shake, that moved with precision suggesting centuries of practice. The truth is, we don't entirely understand it ourselves. Parasitic immortal species that evolved alongside humans for millennia, requiring human blood for sustenance. The transformation involves viral components, genetic restructuring, metabolic processes that operate outside normal biological frameworks. That's not an answer. That's speculation dressed as explanation. Because we don't have better answers. Dr. Park, you'll meet her today, has spent 2 centuries researching vampire physiology. She's identified some mechanisms but admits the whole system defies current scientific models. He took a sip of his coffee. We're functionally immortal. We heal from almost any injury except massive trauma, decapitation, or sustained UV exposure. We require blood to survive. But a single human can sustainably provide for 1 vampire through careful feeding. Once every 2 weeks, small amounts, time for recovery between donations. The collective doesn't follow those rules. No. They represent old world philosophy, humans as livestock, blood farms maximizing extraction through captive populations. It's efficient from their perspective. Barbaric from mine. I spread the folder's contents across the table. These trafficking networks go back to the 1600s. Further, Lucien established his first operation in 1437. He's adapted with time. Slave ships, workhouses, now biotech facilities. The method changes. The principle remains. The casual way he discussed centuries of systematic exploitation made my hands shake. And you've been here since 1849? The gold rush. Came for the chaos, stayed for the territory. California suited me. Enough transient population that controlled feeding didn't raise suspicions, enough wealth that I could build legitimate businesses as cover. He studied me with those crimson eyes. I've spent 400 years trying to evolve my kind away from predation. Territorial laws that prevent overhunting. Donor systems with consent and compensation. Research into synthetic alternatives. Most of my kind have adapted. Lucien refuses. My sister. The words came out harder than intended. The files say he turned her. What does that mean? Something shifted in Alaric's expression. Pity mixed with resignation. 6 years ago, Bridget was recruited into what she thought was a legitimate trial. Lucien recognized her value, genuine medical knowledge, sincere desire to help others. Rather than simply harvesting her blood, he turned her into a vampire without consent. The transformation is irreversible. She's been under his control ever since, used as a recruiter because her authentic expertise makes her convincing to other potential victims. The revelation hit like physical force. I'd spent 6 years imagining Bridget dead, mourning her, building shrines from memories and guilt. The reality was so much worse. She existed. She'd existed this entire time, transformed into the thing that had taken her, working for her captors, luring others into the same fate. She's alive. My voice cracked. She's been alive and I've been looking in all the wrong places. She's alive. But Caroline. He leaned forward and I saw genuine concern in his expression. She's not entirely herself anymore. Blood bonding, thrall compulsion. Lucien has methods of control that go beyond psychological manipulation. Breaking those bonds is possible but complex. Dangerous. Then we break them. Perhaps. He wants them broken. 6 years of vampirism changes people. Not everyone wants to return to humanity even if they could. He pulled out documentation from his own files. I've spent 6 years building a case against Lucien under vampire law. Our justice system requires proof of territorial violation and harm to the vampire community, not humans. Your documentation, patent fraud, human rights violations, photographic evidence, gives me leverage I've never had. Work with me. Combine your evidence with my authority. We shut down the collective, rescue those 23 humans, and I'll do everything in my power to break Lucien's bond over your sister. Why? I demanded. Why do you care about human victims? Why spend 6 years on this? Because 150 years ago in New Orleans, I failed to stop a similar operation. By the time I acted, 40 humans had died. His jaw tightened. That guilt has driven every reform I've implemented since. I'm trying to create a supernatural society that doesn't require human suffering. Lucien represents everything I'm trying to eliminate. He spent the next hour showing me his operation. Technology companies that were genuinely legitimate, blood supply systems using willing donors who consented to regular donation in exchange for financial compensation and supernatural protection. He introduced me to Dr. Helena Park, a Korean vampire who'd been turned during the Joseon dynasty and now ran a state-of-the-art hematology lab beneath the estate. 200 years researching ethical blood alternatives, Helena said, adjusting gold-rimmed glasses she didn't need but wore from habit. Her warm personality contradicted everything I'd expected from vampires. We're close to a viable synthetic, but adoption faces cultural resistance. Many of our kind view hunting as tradition rather than necessity. The world Alaric showed me wasn't the horror movie I'd expected. It was organized, regulated, populated by beings trying, however imperfectly, to coexist with humanity rather than simply prey on it. While Alaric handled vampire politics through encrypted calls in languages I didn't recognize, I buried myself in his estate's extensive library. Found records of him arriving in California in 1849, buying property during the gold rush chaos. Historical documentation showing repeated interventions to prevent vampire excesses. Feeding frenzies stopped during the 1906 earthquake. Peace treaties negotiated between supernatural factions in the 1960s. Evidence of decades funding medical research into synthetic blood alternatives. The picture emerging was of a vampire genuinely trying to evolve his species away from predation, fighting against centuries of tradition and instinct. On the third night, I found him in the library examining a first-edition Keats with reverence that suggested he'd known the poet personally. Published 1820, he said softly. I met Keats once in Rome months before he died. Brilliant mind consumed by tuberculosis. Our hands touched over the fragile pages, and electricity went through me that had nothing to do with fear. He was impossibly dangerous, technically dead, had survived 4 centuries by feeding on humans. And somehow I was drawn to his intelligence, his unexpected humor when discussing human absurdity, the way he listened to my theories about patent law like they mattered. The video call came on day 5. Alaric's secured line, military-grade encryption, he'd said, buzzed with incoming connection from an unknown source. Bridget's face filled the screen and I stopped breathing. She looked exactly as she had 6 years ago. Same features, same age, frozen at 23 forever. But her eyes were wrong, cold, predatory, with red tints I now recognized as vampiric. She spoke in measured tones that sounded like her voice but carried inflections that were alien. Caro, stop looking for me. I'm not who I was. Lucien made me better, stronger, faster, immortal. You're in danger with Alaric. He's using you to build a case against us. Come meet me alone and I'll explain everything. The call cut off before I could respond, leaving me staring at blank screen while my heart shattered all over again. Alaric appeared in the doorway. It's a trap. Lucien wants to draw you out, eliminate you before you can testify under vampire law. I know. My voice sounded distant. But it's her. She's alive and what is she? Controlled. The blood bond Lucien created when he turned her means her will isn't entirely her own. She loves you, I don't doubt that, but that love is filtered through vampire instincts and forced loyalty. He offered me a choice then. Arrange a meeting with Bridget in neutral territory with supernatural witnesses or walk away. Return to my human life, stop investigating, let the vampires handle vampire business. You've seen too much to go back unchanged, he warned. But you can choose to not go further into darkness. I won't judge that decision. I thought of 23 humans in holding cells. Of 6 years searching for my sister. Of justice that institutions like Rebecca's patent office had failed to deliver. I thought of Bridget's text message, "Love you, Caro," sent from a life she'd never get to live. I'm staying. We're shutting them down. Alaric's phone buzzed 2 nights later with intelligence that changed everything. One of the collective's facilities was preparing for major activity. They were accelerating the timeline, moving captive humans to overseas locations within 48 hours. Then we move now, I said immediately. Not we. This is supernatural business. You'll be killed. Those are humans in cages. My voice rose. My sister is one of them, even if she doesn't think so anymore. I'm not staying behind while you risk everything. Our first real argument. Alaric explaining vampire combat capabilities I had no defense against. Me countering that my documentation, my testimony, my human perspective on what constituted legal evidence. These were weapons more powerful than supernatural strength. You're stubborn. You're paternalistic. He laughed despite himself, then sobered. If you come, you follow my orders exactly. No heroics. No improvisation. Agreed. Agreed. We had 48 hours to plan a raid that would either save 23 lives or start a war that would expose vampires to humanity and force the kind of consequences neither side wanted. I was terrified. I was determined. And somehow, impossibly, I trusted this ancient predator more than I'd trusted any human institution. The clock was running. Bridget was waiting. And I was about to walk into darkness voluntarily, carrying evidence and hope in equal measure. The war room existed 3 levels beneath Alaric's estate, accessed through an elevator that required both keycard and biometric scan. The space looked like something from military thrillers. Digital maps covering entire walls, communications equipment that probably cost more than my yearly salary, a conference table surrounded by people who moved with either supernatural grace or tactical precision. Alaric stood at the center, commanding attention without raising his voice. 3 facilities displayed on the screens behind him. NextGen in Sunnyvale, Crimson Therapeutics in Redwood City, Eternal Preservation near San Jose Airport. Each location marked with intel I recognized from my own investigation and details I'd never found. Security rotations, basement levels not shown on public blueprints, holding cells containing 7 to 8 humans per facility. 23 people. 23 lives depending on a plan that involved trusting vampires to rescue humans from other vampires. Dr. Helena Park stood beside Alaric, looking incongruous in her lab coat among the tactical gear and weapons. The man to Alaric's right radiated military authority despite civilian clothing. African American, maybe late 30s in appearance, with the kind of bearing that suggested he'd been giving orders long before he'd become immortal. Vincent Russo, Alaric introduced. Security chief. Former military contractor, turned 1968. Vincent studied me with assessment that felt clinical rather than hostile. The human who photographed NextGen and lived to talk about it. Impressive or lucky? Both, I admitted. She has documentation, Alaric said, gesturing for me to present. Show them. I spread my evidence across the conference table. Patent applications with highlighted inconsistencies, corporate registration showing shell company connections, photographic proof of the holding cells, testimonies from families of missing persons. 3 months of obsessive investigation laid out in organized chaos that made sense to me even if it looked like madness to others. Vincent picked up a patent filing, scanned it with speed that suggested vampire reading abilities exceeded human norms. This proves they're operating without territorial permits. Falsifying research credentials. Creating new vampires without authorization. He looked at Alaric. She's identified legal vulnerabilities we missed. Because you're thinking like vampires, I said. I'm thinking like someone who's spent years tracking corporate fraud. They're hiding behind legitimate business structures, but they've made mistakes. Patent language too similar. Suggests single author trying to establish multiple claims. Corporate addresses that don't match utility records. Clinical trial registrations that reference facilities that don't exist in medical databases. Helena examined my timeline correlating disappearances with patent filings. This is extraordinary work. How did human authorities miss this pattern? They didn't look. Missing adults aren't priorities unless there's obvious foul play. Bitterness crept into my voice. My sister vanished 6 years ago. The police filed a report and forgot her name. Silence settled over the war room, heavy with implications nobody wanted to voice. Finally Vincent spoke. If you're coming on this raid, you need training. Basic combat protocol. How to not die when things go wrong, and things always go wrong. The next 6 hours were brutal education in supernatural warfare. Vincent taught me vampire combat realities with the detached efficiency of someone who'd spent decades in actual combat. They're faster than you, stronger than you, and they heal from anything except massive trauma, sunlight, or decapitation. Your advantages: UV flashbangs that cause excruciating pain without permanent damage, liquid silver aerosols that burn on contact, and the fact that they'll underestimate you because you're human. He handed me a weapon that looked like a modified pistol. UV emission sidearm. Causes pain equivalent to being set on fire. Non-lethal but incapacitating. Alaric's requirement: no kills unless absolutely necessary. I spent hours learning to shoot, my hands aching from recoil, my accuracy improving from abysmal to merely poor. Vincent watched with the patience of someone who'd trained countless people and knew desperation could compensate for lack of skill. Late that night, unable to sleep with adrenaline and fear fighting for dominance in my bloodstream, I found Alaric in his study reviewing final operational plans. The exhaustion on his face surprised me. I'd assumed vampires didn't get tired. If we rescue them, we turn this over to human authorities, I said without preamble. These companies broke human laws. Federal crimes. The victims deserve justice through proper channels. Human courts can't prosecute vampires without exposing our existence. Alaric's voice was patient but firm. Which triggers ancient fail-safes. Vampires worldwide would be required to eliminate all witnesses, including the rescued humans. Exposure threatens our entire species. My people's justice is harsh but effective. Your justice is executions without trial. That's not justice, that's revenge. Your justice is years of appeals while victims suffer. Bureaucracy that lets perpetrators walk on technicalities. Neither system is perfect. We work with what we have. I wanted to argue to defend institutions I'd spent my career serving. But I remembered Rebecca dismissing my evidence, police filing reports about Bridget and forgetting her, the FDA ignoring my concerns about suspicious patents. Maybe Alaric was right. Maybe perfect justice was impossible and we could only choose between imperfect alternatives. Why do you care specifically about this case? I asked. You've been investigating Lucien for 6 years. That's longer than most humans would commit to anything. Something shifted in his expression. Ancient pain surfacing briefly before being contained again. 150 years ago in New Orleans, I failed to stop a similar operation. There was a warehouse near the docks where Lucien was holding humans for blood harvesting. I knew about it. I was building a case, gathering evidence, trying to work within vampire political frameworks. By the time I acted, 40 humans had died. He stood and walked to the window overlooking dark forests. That guilt has driven every reform I've implemented since. Every territorial law restricting hunting. Every donor system based on consent rather than coercion. Every dollar I've spent on synthetic blood research. I'm trying to create a supernatural society that doesn't require human suffering. Lucien represents everything I'm fighting against. We're both haunted by the people we couldn't save. Yes. He turned to face me. Your sister. My 4D. The question is whether we can save the people who still have a chance. I found him again near midnight in his library, staring at an old photograph with expression I couldn't read. The image showed him, unmistakably him despite period clothing, with 3 people who shared enough features to be family. Mother, father, younger sister, all frozen in time by whoever had operated the camera in 1873. I sat beside him without speaking, understanding that some grief doesn't need words. Do you regret becoming what you are? Finally asked. Every day. His voice was quiet. And never. Immortality means witnessing beauty across centuries. Renaissance art, age of enlightenment, technological revolution. But it also means watching everyone you love age and die repeatedly unless you turn them into predators like yourself. He touched the photograph gently. My family chose mortality. I respected that choice even as it destroyed me. Our hands met over the fragile photograph, and this time neither of us pulled away. The kiss happened naturally, desperately, two people acknowledging they might not survive tomorrow. That connection mattered even when logic screamed warnings about species barriers and impossible futures. His lips were cool but not cold, and when he deepened the kiss, I tasted something that might have been wine or might have been blood or might have been 4 centuries of loneliness finding temporary relief. We pulled apart eventually, breathing hard despite him not technically needing to breathe. This is reckless, I whispered. Profoundly. He rested his forehead against mine. But I've lived 400 years being careful. Sometimes recklessness is its own reward. The raid began at 3:47 a.m. with surgical precision. 3 teams moving simultaneously against 3 facilities. Alaric led the primary assault on NextGen, the largest operation holding 9 humans. Vincent commanded the team hitting Eternal Preservation. The Crimson Therapeutics raid went to a vampire named Christoph who I'd met briefly during planning. I was assigned to the support team coordinating from vehicles parked 3 blocks from the Redwood City facility, monitoring communications and surveillance feeds. Safe, peaceful, completely removed from actual danger. Then Bridget appeared on the surveillance feed, moving through Crimson Therapeutics with files in her arms, and I stopped listening to orders. I slipped away from the support vehicle while the coordinator was focused on Vincent's team reporting contact with collective guards. Used the blueprints I'd memorized during planning sessions to approach from the building's south entrance where loading dock doors stood open for the transport Lucien had scheduled. Inside smelled like antiseptic and something else. Coppery and wrong, like blood left too long in industrial storage. I navigated corridors using memory and desperation, found the holding cells disguised as patient rooms. 7 humans in medically induced comas, IVs extracting blood continuously into collection bags that hung like macabre decorations. My veterinary first aid training from childhood 4-H wasn't designed for human medical emergencies, but basic principles applied. Remove the IVs. Check vital signs. Begin gradual revival protocols that wouldn't send sedated patients into shock. I'd freed 3 when I heard footsteps approaching. Ducked into a supply closet as 2 collective vampires entered, discussing logistics with casual brutality. Transport leaves in 20 minutes. Lucien wants all subjects prepped for overseas facilities. What about the O'Brien woman? Did they find her? Not yet. But she can't hide forever. Lucien has plans for her sister's recruiter training. They separated to check on patients. I waited until one passed my hiding spot, then used the UV pistol Vincent had drilled me on. The vampire collapsed with a scream that sounded almost human, agony bypassing supernatural stoicism. His companion turned and I fired again before rational thought could interfere. Both vampires writhing on the floor gave me time to continue evacuating humans, dragging semi-conscious bodies toward the exit with strength I didn't know I possessed. I found Bridget in an office reviewing patient files like this was normal work instead of systematic exploitation. She turned at my entrance and for one perfect moment I saw my sister. Recognition, love, the woman who'd given me lipstick for my birthday and texted me about brunch plans. Then it froze over, replaced by something cold and predatory. You shouldn't be here, Caro. She moved toward an alarm panel. I raised the UV weapon with shaking hands, aiming at my own sister. Don't. Please. We can fix this. Alaric says there's a way to break blood bonds. Bridget laughed, bitter and wrong. Fix this? I'm not broken. I'm better. Stronger. I'll never age, never get sick, never die. Lucien gave me immortality. He took your choice. That's not a gift, that's slavery. Before she could respond, before I could lower the weapon or fire it or find some third option that didn't exist, Lucien Moreau materialized behind me. I'd forgotten how fast they could move, forgotten that vampires didn't make sounds humans could hear when they wanted silence. He disarmed me casually, one hand closing around my throat with pressure that could crush my windpipe effortlessly. So the little investigator has teeth. Alaric's influence, no doubt. Tell me, Ms. O'Brien, was it worth it? Saving these cattle? My vision darkened as his grip tightened. I clawed at his hand uselessly, struggling for air that wouldn't come. This was it. This was how I died. In a facility I'd broken into against orders, having accomplished nothing except proving I was as reckless as everyone had warned. Then Alaric crashed through the wall. Not through a door, through the actual wall. Brick and steel and reinforced concrete exploding inward from vampiric strength that made Lucien's casual brutality look restrained. Debris rained down as Alaric emerged from the destruction, eyes blazing crimson, fangs fully extended, looking like the apex predator he truly was. "She's mine," he said with quiet fury that was more terrifying than shouting. "You don't touch what's mine." Lucien released me and I collapsed, gasping. What followed wasn't a fight. It was forces of nature colliding. They moved faster than my eyes could track, blurs of motion punctuated by impacts that shook the building's foundation. Supernatural speed and strength unleashed without restraint, destroying everything around them. I grabbed Bridget's arm, trying to drag her toward safety, but she pulled free with vampiric strength. "I need to help Lucien. He's enslaved you. Can't you see that?" He freed me from being weak and mortal and afraid. The fight moved toward the main laboratory, taking half the office wall with them. I followed, found 6 humans I'd evacuated huddled in the corridor, traumatized but alive. The 7th, a young man in his 20s, remained sedated in the lab. I ran for him. Bridget blocked my path, moving with the supernatural speed I couldn't match. "You can't save him. He's already scheduled for turning. Lucien needs more vampires loyal to the collective." Behind her, Alaric was losing ground. 3 more collective vampires had arrived, surrounding him with coordinated attacks that even his 4 centuries of experience couldn't fully counter. I looked at Bridget, at my sister wearing a stranger's cold expression, and raised the UV weapon I'd recovered from where Lucien had thrown it. "I'm sorry," I whispered. I fired. The UV blast hit Bridget's center mass. She screamed, a sound of pure agony that would haunt every dream I'd have for the rest of my life, and collapsed to the floor, convulsing from pain that vampiric healing couldn't immediately counteract. In that moment, with Bridget incapacitated, the blood bond weakened. Across the laboratory, Lucien felt it, distraction flickering across his face as his control over his progeny wavered. It was enough. Alaric struck with precision that decades of restraint had been hiding, and Lucien went down. The other collective vampires hesitated, uncertain without their leader's authority, and that's when Vincent's tactical team flooded the building, SWAT-style vampire soldiers in body armor, moving with military efficiency. The raid succeeded. 23 humans rescued. Lucien and primary collective leadership captured. Clean victory by any operational standard. I knelt beside Bridget's unconscious form, crying, whispering apologies she couldn't hear. I'd saved her life by shooting her. I'd freed her by causing her agony. Some choices don't have good options. They only have the least terrible alternative available. Alaric's hand on my shoulder. "We need to move. Authorities will respond to the commotion." I nodded, unable to speak, watching as Vincent's team carefully transported my sister alongside captured collective members. I'd spent 6 years searching for Bridget. Now I'd found her, and I didn't know if she'd ever forgive me for it. Stanford Medical Center had a wing that didn't appear on any public floor plans, accessed through corridors that required credentials most hospital staff didn't possess. Dr. Helena Park supervised the treatment of 23 rescued humans with the kind of meticulous care that came from 2 centuries of medical practice. The cover story was elegant in its simplicity. Victims of an illegal medical facility, found during a federal raid, identities protected pending investigation. No mention of vampires. No explanation for the bite marks that had healed with supernatural speed or the blood loss that should have been fatal but wasn't quite. I sat beside Bridget's hospital bed in a different room, watching my sister's unconscious form with exhaustion that went beyond physical. She looked peaceful in sedation, face relaxed, breathing simulated through vampiric reflex rather than biological necessity. The specialized formula keeping her unconscious had been developed by Alaric's researchers specifically for situations like this, When vampires needed medical intervention without the risk of violent awakening. Helena entered with a tablet displaying Bridget's treatment plan. The procedure to break Lucien's blood bond is experimental but promising. We'll need weeks of controlled transfusions, replacing his blood in her system with neutral vampire blood. Combined with psychological counseling and voluntary participation once she's conscious. Will she be herself again? I can't promise she'll be who she was before. Helena's honesty was both refreshing and devastating. 6 years as a vampire changes people fundamentally. But we can give her free will back. What she does with it will be her choice, not Lucien's compulsion. The word felt heavy with implications. Bridget had been denied choice for 6 years. Transformed without consent, controlled through blood bonding, used as a tool for recruiting others. Now we were offering her choice back and I had no idea if she'd want what we were offering. 3 days later, Alaric took me to the tribunal. We drove to Sacramento in his car. Not the limousine but something more understated, a Tesla that blended into California's tech-wealthy aesthetic. The destination was a Gold Rush-era mansion that had been repurposed by vampires who valued historical architecture and needed private space for supernatural justice. Inside, the proceedings felt like stepping into the past. 12 vampire leaders from across North America sat in a semicircle, their combined age measuring in millennia. Lucien and his primary associates knelt in the center, bound with silver chains that burned their skin wherever contact occurred. The charges were read in multiple languages. English, French, languages I didn't recognize that predated modern linguistics. Territorial violation. Unauthorized vampire creation. Endangering the supernatural community through reckless exposure risks. Operating blood farms in violation of territorial agreements established in 1887. The trial was archaic, brutal, efficient. No lawyers. No appeals process. Just evidence presented, testimony heard, judgment rendered. Guilty on all counts. The punishment made my stomach turn. Permanent imprisonment in specialized facilities that were essentially vampire prisons. Locked away from blood sources, kept in perpetual starvation state that wouldn't kill them but would make death seem preferable. It's torture, I whispered to Alaric. It's deterrence. His voice was quiet. Execution would make Lucien a martyr to old-world vampires who share his philosophy. This way he's a warning about what happens when you violate territorial law and endanger our entire species through carelessness. I wanted to argue about cruel and unusual punishment, about justice systems that shouldn't rely on suffering as deterrents. But I thought of 40 humans who died in New Orleans while Alaric built a proper case. Of Bridget, controlled for 6 years. Of 23 people who'd barely escaped the same fate. Maybe perfect justice was impossible. Maybe we could only choose between imperfect alternatives and hope the choice we made caused less harm than the alternative. 3 weeks after the raid, Bridget woke. Helena called me at 3 a.m., and I drove to the medical facility still wearing pajamas under my jacket. My sister sat up in bed, looking disoriented, with eyes that flashed between brown and red like her body couldn't decide which she was anymore. Caro. Her voice cracked. What happened? Where's Lucien? Imprisoned. You're free. The blood bond is broken. I watched her process that information, emotions flickering across her face too quickly to catalog. Recognition, confusion, and then, devastatingly, memory. She remembered everything. Her human life, the 6 years under Lucien's control, every person she'd recruited into trials that were traps. I knew it was wrong. Tears streamed down her face. Vampires could cry apparently, though whether from emotion or biological reflex I couldn't tell. Even while I was recruiting people, some part of me knew. But his blood in my veins made it feel right, necessary. Like I was saving them by bringing them into our world. You weren't yourself. He controlled you. I was myself enough to feel guilty while doing it. Just not myself enough to stop. She looked at her hands like they belonged to someone else. I've become the monster we used to joke about. Remember when we watched those vampire movies and laughed about how ridiculous they were? We held each other and cried. 2 sisters who'd lost 6 years to different kinds of grief, reunited by circumstances neither of us would have believed possible. Rebecca Walsh showed up at my Mountain View apartment a week later. I'd returned there after the first few days at Alaric's estate, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy even though normalcy had become a concept from someone else's life. The FBI is investigating the biotech facility raids, Rebecca said without preamble, standing in my doorway with expression I couldn't read. Your name has come up multiple times in connection with Alaric Saltzman. Whatever you got involved with, Caroline, it's bigger than patent fraud. Federal agents are asking questions I can't answer and wouldn't know how to even if I could. I invited her in, made coffee neither of us wanted, and tried to figure out how to explain the unexplainable. I can't tell you what happened. Not because I don't trust you, but because the truth would put you in danger. I met her eyes. Those 23 people who were rescued, that was real. The trafficking operation was real. Everything else, you're better off not knowing. Rebecca studied me with decades of bureaucratic wisdom. You're resigning, aren't you? I have to. For your protection as much as mine. Caroline, you were the best investigator I've had in 10 years. Obsessive, yes. Boundary crossing, absolutely. But brilliant at seeing patterns nobody else noticed. She set down her untouched coffee. Whatever you're doing now, I hope it's worth what you're giving up. I submitted my resignation letter the next day, citing personal health reasons that were technically true. My mental health had been shattered and rebuilt into something that could accommodate supernatural reality. Walking away from my career felt like amputation, necessary but agonizing. Alaric's offer came 2 days later, delivered over dinner at his estate while I picked at food and he pretended to enjoy wine he didn't need. Work with me. Consultant investigating supernatural abuses using your legal and analytical skills. There are other vampires like Lucian, other operations harming humans. You've seen both worlds now. You know how to document crimes in ways that satisfy both human and vampire law. And the complications? You'd be working for a vampire, abandoning your human professional identity, living partially in a supernatural world you didn't believe in 3 weeks ago. He met my eyes. I won't pretend it's an easy choice. I thought about it for exactly 12 seconds. I accept. On my terms. I maintain my apartment in Mountain View. I keep using my human name and identity. And if your methods become too ruthless, I reserve the right to walk away. Agreed. Partners, not master and servant. Equals, despite the obvious power differential. 3 months after the raid, we were still figuring out what dating across species lines actually meant. Alaric didn't eat human food, could tolerate it but gained no nutrition, so meals became strange affairs where I ate while he drank wine and we talked about everything from patent law to 4 centuries of human absurdity he'd witnessed firsthand. His feeding schedule still unsettled me, even knowing he used consenting donors who were financially compensated and medically monitored. Watching him leave once a week for appointments with people who let him drink their blood required mental gymnastics I was still perfecting. We compromised where we could. Late dinners at restaurants where he'd order food he wouldn't eat to maintain appearances. Weekend trips where he showed me historical sites from perspectives only someone who'd lived through the history could provide. Quiet mornings where he'd watch me sleep before retiring to light-proof chambers during daylight hours when sunlight made his existence painful. It was weird. It worked. And somehow, impossibly, I was falling in love with a 400-year-old predator who was trying to be better than his nature demanded. Bridget chose to remain a vampire but refused to feed on humans. Dr. Park helped her transition to synthetic blood alternatives, less satisfying nutritionally and missing something essential, but ethically acceptable to someone consumed with guilt about her 6 years under compulsion. She enrolled in online courses focusing on psychology and trauma recovery. I want to work with other vampires struggling with what they've become, she explained during one of our weekly sister dinners. Turn my experience into something useful instead of just carrying it as shame. I watched her find purpose in tragedy, transforming guilt into service, and felt pride mixed with lingering grief for the 6 years we'd lost. My first official investigation for Alaric came 3 months after the raid. A pharmaceutical company in Portland had filed patents for age regression treatments that matched the pattern I'd learned to recognize, too similar to legitimate research, but with suspicious corporate structures and missing persons correlating to clinical trial recruitment. I packed my investigative kit, laptop, documentation templates, the worn leather messenger bag that had survived everything. Kissed Alaric goodbye, which was still strange, kissing someone with fangs that he was careful never to let touch me. Drove north on I-5 while dawn painted the sky colors that would hurt him to see directly. The Portland coffee shop at 6 a.m. was perfect. Quiet enough for concentration, busy enough to blend in. I spread patent applications across my table, cross-referenced them with missing persons reports from Oregon databases, started building the timeline and documentation that would either prove pattern or coincidence. My phone buzzed. Text from Bridget, "Good luck, Caro. Save them like you saved me. Love you." Another text from Alaric. "Remember, UV flashbangs don't engage alone, call for backup if needed. And come home safe." I smiled despite the anxiety that came with starting new investigations. Ordered another coffee. Opened my laptop. Got to work. The world was full of monsters. That much I'd learned. But it was also full of people trying to fight them, to protect the vulnerable, to achieve justice through whatever means available even when those means existed outside traditional systems. I was one of those people now. Not a patent investigator working within bureaucratic frameworks but something else. Someone who operated between worlds, who understood both human law and supernatural justice, who could document evidence in ways that satisfied courts and tribunals that would never officially acknowledge each other's existence. My career was destroyed. My sister was permanently a vampire. I was in a relationship with an immortal predator. None of this resembled the life I'd planned or the future I'd imagined. But 23 people were alive because I'd refused to accept institutional indifference. Bridget had her free will back because I'd been willing to shoot her to save her. Justice had been served through imperfect systems because I'd learned to work within impossibility. This wasn't happily ever after. This was meaningful ever after. Purpose found in complexity, principles maintained while accepting nuance, fighting continuing because the vulnerable would always need protection and monsters would always need opposition. There would be more cases, more victims, more impossible choices between imperfect alternatives. And I'd keep fighting with my vampire boyfriend who was trying to evolve his species away from predation, my vampire sister who was transforming guilt into service, and my human determination that evidence and documentation could change worlds, even supernatural ones. The coffee shop filled with morning commuters. I dove into patent applications and missing persons databases, hunting patterns in chaos the way I'd done for Bridget, the way I'd do for whoever needed finding next. Some monsters were irredeemable. Some were trying to be better. And some humans were willing to work with the latter to fight the former, even when that choice meant living in spaces between worlds where nothing was simple and everything was complicated. I was one of those humans now. And somehow, impossibly, I was okay with that. Thank you for watching. We hope you sure enjoyed it. Don't forget to click that subscribe button, hit that like button and share this video. Lastly, tell me where you are watching from. Also click on the image on your screen to watch more beautiful, heartwarming stories and stay updated with our latest content.